Hello, everyone. This is Al Fadi, and I want to welcome you to, we can say, the finale of this fascinating short series and also a brief series on the sonship of Christ. The intent really was just to highlight the importance and the meaning of this particular title, and then take a journey through the New Testament, not necessarily every single book, but we selected the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospel, the Gospel of John, some of the writings of Paul, and today we are going to look at the book of Hebrews and how Hebrews also highlighted the title or the term Son of God, or the sonship, in this case, of Christ himself. With us here virtually in our studios, our dear brother Anthony Rogers. Anthony, thank you, brother, again, as always, for making time for us, and thank you for the wonderful teachings that you have poured out on us in the last few episodes, and we're looking forward to today's episode as well. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Al. It's always a pleasure. So in the book of Hebrews, and you and I both love this book. I know we've talked about it before. I feel like that's true when it comes to every episode here. There's something that we've discussed in one way or another already. But in Hebrews 1, we really don't have to get out of the first chapter, although we could, when it comes to looking at Christ's sonship, the fact that he's the Son, what it means to call him the Son, the importance of calling him the Son. But I'll first just read the first several verses, which are just so power-packed in themselves. There's enough there to spend an entire hour or two on. But it says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son. And here, it's important, in order to understand already how he's using the term Son, to note the finality and the climactic nature of this, given what the author of Hebrews has said. He's telling us that God has revealed himself in the past through many prophets, but partially, right? Many times, many ways. The very language is a way of saying that this revelation of God was true, but incomplete. But then he says, but, he uses the strong adversative here, but in these last days, he has spoken. Now using a particular grammatical form to indicate the finality of this. Mm-hmm. He has spoken in his Son. So this revelation in the Son is climactic. So clearly he's not Son in any ordinary sense, according to the author of Hebrews. He is the final, the full, the climactic, the complete revelation of God to men. Then he goes on to say, whom he appointed heir of all things. So this one who is the Son is the heir of everything. This is language that Muslims should be familiar with, because Allah says that he's the one who's going to inherit everything. It's not a way of saying this one is not the creator of everything. It's just a way of saying it all ultimately belongs to him, right? Well, that's true in the New Testament as well. In fact, notice what it goes on to say. He appointed him heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. Mm-hmm. So this Son, who is the final, full, and complete revelation of God, the one who's going to inherit everything, is also the one through whom everything was made.
That's right.
So he's not any ordinary Son, is he? He's a Son in the sense that we've already clearly defined in previous episodes. He's the Son in a divine sense. One more from this particular part before looking later in the prologue, but he says, he is the radiance of his glory in verse 3 and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. So this Son who was with the Father and made all things and is the climactic revelation of God is also the one who upholds all things. Now, why was he able with the Father to create and with the Father able to uphold all things? Precisely because he is the radiance, the effulgence, the outshining of God's glory, the exact representation of his nature, as the author of Hebrews says. How much clearer can you get that being the Son does not mean that Christ is something less than absolute deity?
That's right. That's right. It's amazing indeed. I mean, like you said, just the first two verses of this particular letter are amazing, and it's many believe it's a sermon. Actually, I mean, at least when you study the book and its composition, and the author, of course, laid out the supremacy of Christ and his superiority over many things in the Old Testament, including Moses, the high priest, and Melchizedek, and the list can go on and on and on.
Yeah, and in fact, that actually gets us into some of the rest of what the author says here, because you say it's about the superiority of Christ, and you mentioned certain Old Testament figures. Notice here that it goes on to speak of his superiority to the angels. Mm-hmm. So even the angels, who are greater at present in terms of their power, right? They have a particular position hierarchically. Man is ultimately going to be exalted above them because man was made in God's image. But this is all after God's purposes are worked out in history and people are redeemed and united to Christ and exalted. But at present, angels are superior to men, and yet Jesus is said to be superior to the angels, right? He goes on to say that Jesus is better than the angels and has inherited a name more excellent than they. And then he says, "For to which of the angels did he," meaning God, "ever say, 'You are my son, this day I have begotten you'?" Now, here I want to stop for a moment. And again, I wish we had more time, but I'm going to have to be brief and kind of direct people to some things for further study on this. Here in verse 5, he begins his litany of Old Testament quotations with a quotation from Psalm 2. If you go to the end of Hebrews 1 and you look at his final quotation, it's a quotation from Psalm 110. In the Hebrew text of Psalm 110, it refers to the one who's seated at God's right hand. It refers to him in verse 3 as the one who was begotten before the day star, before creation. Right? That's how it's rendered by Jews in the Greek Septuagint. And so this shows us that the begetting of the Son mentioned in Psalm 2 is not a reference to something that takes place in time, but is a reference to his eternal begetting by the Father. Right? The Father eternally begat him in eternity, the days of eternity, if you will. And so that's why the author of Hebrews is able to quote this passage and say it proves the superiority of Jesus, because it's not a begetting that took place in the today of temporal succession that exists in the world, but in the today of eternity, meaning before time even began.